Welcome back, Bernardos. We're ready to move ahead with another artist from the end of the 20th, last half of the 20th century, I should say, who represents an interesting kind of melding of lots of different traditions that I'm excited to share with you. Yayoi Kusama was a recent addition into our image set, and it seems like we were overlooking a real interesting kind of personality as well as talent. So I'm glad that she's been added to the image set because it highlights the nature of what it's like for people during this time period. If they don't happen to be white, if they don't happen to be male, and if they don't happen to be taken seriously in either of the countries from which they hail. So it's a really interesting story. I'll recommend to you for later viewing. You don't have time right now, I'm sure. The documentary on her life called Infinity. Some of the links that I have are trailers and interviews with the director, and I think it's a really interesting window on this time in history. A lot of ideas are changing, and Kusama is going to live through all of them. We're looking at one from the early 60s here, Narcissus Garden, but her body of work has continued to change and morph over time, and she is alive and well in Japan today, making artwork that is heavily appreciated all over the globe. The DMA recently bought one of her pieces, the My Eternal Love for the Pumpkins, and it's an infinity room that we'll take a look at in a second. But I want to take you back to the timeline, and I want to show you essentially, basically, let's see here if I've got the right timeline. There we are. Basically, that we're connecting Kusama to basically everything that's come before. I mean, she really engages multiple forms of art making in this kind of transformative period in the 1960s. And so I'm taking you back to my modern timeline that shows you the beginning of the 20th century. Here we are in pop, right? So we basically can see after that, we're going to push back toward a world of images and representation. This is all modernism. Then we're going to push back from the 70s with postmodernism. And you see some names here like Kusama, Frankenthaler, you have de Kooning, and I want to show you where she fits in this whole big picture. So I need to show you a couple of different art movements that she kind of accesses in Narcissus Garden that would be important as influencers. So I'm going to start with organic sculpture. All right. So, in terms of sculpture mid century, artists were beginning to engage this kind of reductive process to create something that was, in a way, responding more organically to the media and the materials that the sculpture used or utilized. So, we have artists like Britain's Barbara Hepworth here exploiting void and solid relationships in artwork that is sculpted from wood. Basically creating a new kind of figure void study for us to explore moving in and out and around the sculpture, as if to say that sculpture is not just a solid thing. It's something that has dimension and space, and we just need to unlock those depending on what media we're working with. Here we have a Hepworth at the DMA. These marble shapes that look like eggs or ovoid forms represent a mother with her children as being kind of like satellites to a larger figure. As far as whether that works for you, you have to kind of experience it to see if it works in first person. These are reductive ideas. We're approaching the era of minimalism, so we're stripping away the narrative elements that would help you understand where the inspiration may be coming from. In this work, we have a Henry Moore, who's also British, working with these recumbent reclining figures, says that he's inspired by chalk mule figures, which are the soldiers we see in Mesoamerica on the top of the pyramids, resting on their backs, holding a vessel that's basically going to hold a donation for the temple. This is a gladiator abstracted to show you a fallen warrior. I'm reminded of the dying warrior on the temple of the Phi at Aegina, where the warrior has fallen. There's a sense of pathos, and we see his anatomy begin to give over to death. So we have a head, we have a torso. It is abstract in the way that we see the body used, but you kind of get the sense that this is supposed to be a recumbent figure, organically crafted from the media of bronze. So this is an interesting kind of derivation. Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture is kind of going to go here too, with a more organic response to the site, the media, the materials. So there's kind of a correlation between the two at that point. But the other arm of sculpture at the time was a very minimalistic kind of approach to media and process. And what you get when you round the corner into one of these galleries is basically media spread out on the floor, media stacked up or attached to the wall, or the basic media applied almost like a painting, but not decorated with any brushstrokes. This concept basically creates a artwork of process where you have Donald Judd making his famous collection of Untitled works that look like almost like a skyscraper, where you have shelves made of polished metal and plexiglass frames in the middle in a variety of different combinations, some colored, some not. He emphasized the manufactured fabrication part of the process by sending his directions for the artwork to the factory, having them make it, and then box it up and send it to the museum without the artist ever being present. It was to emphasize the concept of modern conceptual art, basically celebrating the machine as the end all be all for creating artworks that we could enjoy. He too explored these figure void relationships. You can kind of imagine yourself going into the plexiglass and flying through it in like a dreamlike state. But there is no story. It is all process of materials. So people sometimes have frustration with this stuff when they look at it. Dan Flavin, with his light sculptures, wanted to emphasize the forgotten parts of the gallery by stacking his lights on the floor where they reflect off of the floor, something we never think about, or putting them in the corner here to accentuate something that didn't really look that monumental. There's a variety of different combinations, one of which we have at Fort Worth Modern, and his whole focus is the play of light and its effect on your eyes. But this is minimal stuff. There is no story here. It's an experience that you have to see for yourself, an experience. When you walk away from some of these neon lit sculptures, your eyes reverse the colors. So it's kind of like a return of the color optics or the after image that we talked about with Johann Vermeer. Here you see more of them. There was a whole retrospective of his work at the Fort Worth Modern, and I thought it was hilarious. If you drove by, the museum was glowing in neon colors. It was really cool. Other minimal artists like Richard Serra, who makes actually the sculpture outside the Modern called the Vortex, is really working with something he called monumental works in Corten steel. He takes these large slabs of steel and he mounts them in ways that kind of dwarf the person who walks around them. He is referenced growing up in a shipyard where the ships, as they're being built, kind of arc over your head and seem to dominate you in that space. This tilted arc created kind of a problem because the building right behind it is actually a federal center in New York City. And he's kind of created an obstacle from which people could, throw incendiary devices, bombs into the lobby of the federal building. But it was meant to talk about, the obstructions that federal government sometimes can put in our way. He went to court to defend the artwork. It was eventually removed over safety concerns, and it starts this whole discussion about, responsibility in public spaces like this. But these would be influential artists on Yayoi Kusama, who's responding to basically everything going on in the 1960s in America at the time. Happenings were one of those things. This is performance art, where you have people who go into galleries in costume or in normal clothing, basically to provide an experience where they act out certain things. We're looking at a photograph here of a happening by Joseph Beuys, who basically named this piece "How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Rabbit." He's an interesting persona in taking the art itself out of a two-dimensional, fixed three-dimensional perspective and making, time part of that piece. You can't see this artwork anymore because you would have literally had to been there to experience it. And that requires a new name, basically a performance art or happenings is what Kusama is going to work with too. So you get a variety of these installations where you have that kind of focus. You have to kind of be there in order to experience it. Yayoi Kusama is going to pull on all of these veins. Of course, being a female, feminist art is going to be key in her understanding of who she is as an artist and what she would like to say. She feels that she's not being listened to because, let's get it, everybody I've shown you right now, they're guys, they're men, and they're white men, and they're basically well connected in the gallery system. To break into that system as a young Japanese American artist, very, very difficult. But these veins are going to show up. In this piece by Judy Chicago, you have a place setting that's supposed to replicate the Last Supper. And it's supposed to celebrate all the famous women of history that never really get their due. The artist started by making a place setting of 13 spaces for one table and realized she had so many women she wanted to celebrate. She needed to broaden that up a little bit. It's a work in ceramic as well as wood as well as tapestry. So it celebrates the artworks with which women are traditionally associated, and it creates a place setting that's based on female anatomy. When you get close to each one of these, you realize we're truly celebrating the power of the feminine, and each place setting basically celebrates that particular person in the way that, in an iconic way that ties to her personality. So this becomes a movement in the 1960s that we're going to see more of 1970s moving forward to today's Me Too movement. So here we have a photographer, Cindy Sherman, in her famous series Untitled Film Stills. She examines the stereotypes of females and the roles that women play in films. Basically, that's her donning a costume. She loved to play dress up as a kid, and decided to use that early childhood playtime to create images that we would think are telling part of a story from something we recognize. Basically, lots of different personas that represent lots of the different studio Hollywood personas that were created at the time, all playing a character not meant at all to be portraiture, but giving you an idea that there are set, personas we expected women to fit into if they showed up in film or our media. This looks like an Alfred Hitchcock movie to me, where you have this sense of foreboding moment in time. Something's about to happen. Something's going on. You wonder if our heroine is safe. But the idea is that these are like known personas here that basically create a fantasy that we can kind of walk into. So that's a way to examine the female stereotypes of the day. And this is the kind of artwork that Kusama is trying to respond to at a very transformational time in American history. All right, so this is the image of her work in the image set. And I want to remind you, you're obviously not in Venice, you're in Paris. If you look back here, there's the Eiffel Tower. That is the Place de la Concorde, which is right next to the Louvre. So this is the garden called the Tuileries right outside the museum. The name of the work is Narcissus Garden. So I think it kind of ties to the fact that we're in a garden for sure, but you need to know the story of Narcissus to know exactly why she chose the media that she did. We'll talk about that in just a second. But because this was an installation that happened at a given time, we only have context shots of the piece. That she will be known for in the image set. Now, Yayoi Kusama grew up in Japan before World War II in the interwar years, showed very early interest in the world of art as a young kid, but because that was a frivolous pursuit, her mom thought, her mom kept taking away her art materials and telling her she needed to focus on getting through school and then getting married, because that was what she was supposed to do in service to the family. It's a very conservative upbringing that she's going to fight against all of her life, and it creates some mental challenges for her. She develops an obsessive compulsive disorder. There are psychoses that will emerge. She'll even attempt at one point to end her own life because she doesn't feel that she's appreciated in either of the cultures that she's from. She is going to break out, though, and get to America. Can you imagine coming to the United States after 1945 to New York City as a Japanese immigrant, all on your own with no support from anyone, trying to break into the art scene. And she's pretty successful. So basically, the end story, or the end story, is basically going to be one of success, but there's going to be a lot of trial and tribulation for her as she goes through this. She comes to the United States trying to break into the art scene, which is heavily dominated by males, creating different forms of art that are really kind of on the edge and more than avant-garde. They're truly conceptual. She's standing here in this picture in front of one of her wall paintings that she called Infinity Nets. She felt that in her mind, she wasn't really safe until all the surfaces around her were articulated and created a net that kept the negative world out of her mind and kept her in a happy, safe place. So her initial works, when they start coming up, there are these dots that show up as part of her vocabulary as little things that she's basically creating a net over. And you see on the painting, she's painted the stripes and the dots to kind of fuse them together into something that's almost like a protective barrier. You got to remember too, in the 1960s, if you had mental illness or you were getting over that kind of problem, you were pretty much doing it on your own. The drugs that we had to help you with the symptoms of that mental capacity, they were not that helpful. And a lot of people were simply told, just suck it up and things will get better. So Kusama's, juggling a lot. She's got the weight of the art world on her shoulders, as well as this challenge. But it creates some unusual outgrowths and outcomes for her art. Eventually, these dots are going to spill out over the frames that try to contain them, and they begin to become dots on surfaces of animated things. She talks about that process as being just an organic process, here standing with several of her paintings. But eventually the dots just can't be contained by the frame and they spill over into our everyday reality. This is her most recent project at the Hirshhorn and I think at the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. It's called the Obliteration Room. And you're asked as you enter the space to take a dot and put it on a couple of surfaces where you get to help create the art. It's part performance, it's part installation, it's part experiential because we don't know what the finished composition is going to look like. And by the end of it, everything in the room is going to be covered with these dots. We won't know dimensionally where we are. We'll be in the middle of one of Kusama's safe spaces. So it's a very interesting concept. Very popular, of course, as people come in. So early on, you can see she applies dots to herself, to the chairs, to the walls, to the floors, even creates films where she's putting dots and painting dots on other people. As part of the sexual revolution, guys, you should expect to see some nudity in some of the work if you watch that movie Infinity. It's kind of like she's melding everything about contemporary society into her persona as an artist. Here you can see one of the film stills. So it's very transformational to see the foreground and the background kind of blended in together to a flat space. We know we're looking at a photograph, but the dots help us blur our eye, and we seem to be working in a new kind of reality. Here she begins some of her installations. This is a large room of stuffed soft sculpture with her iconic dots that seem to stretch on forever. They're phallic shaped, and she's playing with feminine sexuality. This room is called the Phallize Room, which is a play on the word phallus or penis shaped kind of object. Basically, she does performances in this space. She has other people join her in this space. And it questions, femininity as well as masculinity. So it's very much in keeping with the happenings of the time period that make her kind of a breakout artist who at that time is somewhat misunderstood. This piece is also a breakout piece. She tries to get permission to put this piece at the the Venice Biennale. It's the biannual celebration of up-and-coming global artists, but she's not accepted into the body of predominantly male artists. So she goes rogue and kind of creates this piece, installing it out on the grounds around the Japanese pavilion. and basically bases this off of that myth I was telling you about of Narcissus. Narcissus, you probably already know, is the youth who loves to look at himself so much he doesn't notice the world around him is changing. He even forgets to eat and ends up passing into the world of shade. So his narcissism becomes his own demise. That's where we get the term. Khan Academy did a pretty nice idea here, talking about our own narcissism with Instagram and several other, social media devices like Twitter, and so forth, where we're really kind of obsessed with the virtual selves that we're creating. And it shows you how this artwork, even though it's from the 1960s, is somewhat relevant considering today's society. And perhaps that's why she's seeing a new resurgence and interest in her artwork. She put herself in a kimono, stood outside in the silver metallic balls that were purchased. She did not make them; she purchased them. So you can even see that she's like referencing the world of consumerism and pop art and doing that. She does that even more by showing us that these things are for sale, and people begin to walk up and start to buy them from her as part of the installation. Of course, it's an interesting moment where you see that she says, "Your narcissism is for sale, $2 a piece." So it's really kind of an art sale trying to make people say, look at yourselves and then look at the world around you. If you're so obsessed with this reflected image, how can you see anything else but what's there? But the reflective surfaces engage the environment around them, taking on the mood of what's there, where you see green or blue, sometimes installed in water, sometimes installed in land. You tend to get, mesmerized by the effect. So it takes on a different quality, and you kind of play the role of Narcissus as you get closer and closer. So, as far as her personal biography, guys, this kind of performs the function of a neural net or an infinity net where she feels safe and warm in that environment without the negativity of the outside world getting to her in the midst of that artist. So, you may at some point in your lifetime have the chance to see one of these installations, but it is basically based off of the installation she first posed at the Venice Biennale. It's interesting. We talked about soft sculpture with Klaus Oldenburg, and it's kind of interesting that we don't ever hear Kusama's name. She came up with the idea first. This chair she decorated with phallic imagery in soft sculpture style. And the very next show Oldenburg does is all of his soft sculptures. Does she get thanks for being the inspiration for this? Not a bit. She does an installation called 1,000 Boats, where she covers the walls in wallpaper of reflected images of boats and then does her phallic treatment on a boat. Well, a week later, Andy Warhol does his 1,000 Cows. Having seen Kusama's work in the gallery, does she get any credit? Nope, not so ever, not at all. This image I wanted to show you. I'm going to pull this out. Of course, you can see in the background the image of her phalli room. Later on, another artist does a reflective boxed room where you have an infinity space that's created, and she gets no credit whatsoever. So it's right at this moment that she goes back to Japan, and having come to New York, having tried to work in there, not be accepted there, and then go back to Japan where she's even more counter conservative. It's just too much to handle. And that's the moment that she tries to end her life. But she survives that suicide and ultimately lives on to create these wonderful, fanciful neural nets that we still appreciate and enjoy today. So I encourage you, if you're looking for something that's really interesting and thought-provoking, you should look at the work of Yayoi Kusama and enjoy that documentary Infinity. So there are a lot of influences there. I'll show you the Dallas Museum of Art's My Eternal Love for the Pumpkins. She talks about this work as reflecting the happy time in her life when, growing up on the farm with family, she was impressed by all the array of colors of seeds. They created these wonderful creations that get her typical signature polka dot treatment and seem to stretch on in the mirrored room forever. It's just a fantasy space you can imagine yourself getting lost in. So I highly encourage you to see it at some point when it's on display. But Kusama then is kind of the nexus and intersection of all of those things: feminism, seriality of pop art, installation, happenings. I mean, you really have to be at the right place at the right time to be able to channel all of that successfully simultaneously. And I hope that creates a new appreciation for Kusama for you. I'm going to leave it there for now, and we will move on with more work in just a bit.